Society's capacity to appreciate humanity's diversity is an ever-evolving process. Though we may not recognize it, our perspectives can be narrow, and it takes time to get the full picture. How we care for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities has evolved tremendously since Polk State School opened its doors in 1897. Polk was founded in western Pennsylvania as what was then called an institution for the feeble-minded. The purpose of such institutions was to create a self-contained place where people with disabilities would live, work, and be cared for, separate from mainstream society. Isolated in a rural area, Polk was a community unto itself, where residents grew their own food, made their own clothes, and had their own activities. Like many institutions of its time, Polk's population became very large. Many residents came as children and spent their entire lives there. As more and more residents arrived over the first half of the 20th century, overcrowding led to people being warehoused and neglected. By 1955, Polk had more than 3,400 residents. It had become one of the most populous institutions in the nation and one of the most troubled. By the late 1960s, families and advocates across the nation began pushing for greater transparency and alternatives to the institutional system. In 1972, a small group of activists from a local chapter of the ARC of Pennsylvania exposed inhumane conditions at Polk, demanded immediate changes, and propelled the deinstitutionalization movement.
We would go to inspect, make unannounced visits to these centers.
I was astonished the first time that I went onto a ward and saw just bed after bed after bed after bed, very little space in between, perhaps as many as 40 individuals living in a communal bedroom.
We saw cages. We saw a human being in a cage, and the cage was about 6 feet tall, wooden slats on all sides and on top.
Advocates called for services in the community and laws that would safeguard the rights of people with disabilities. They called for special education, which would create a path to self-sufficiency rather than dependency. A landmark lawsuit led to the 1972 Park Consent Decree, which guaranteed the right to education in Pennsylvania and became a model for the nation. Society's thinking continued to evolve. More and more people with intellectual and developmental disabilities began to receive services at home and in their communities. The movement to end institutionalization prioritized individualized services, self-determination, choice, and the opportunity to flourish in the community. By the 1980s, Polk's population declined dramatically as people moved into communities. Even so, many residents remained at Polk. It continued to be the place they called home, a place they considered to be their community and even their family.
It was like a college campus. That's what it always reminded me of, green farmland, and it was beautiful.
But institutionalization and congregate care have inherent drawbacks. Regimentation, limits to freedom. The movement toward home and community-based services continued.
There was a very strong evolution. The population declined. The services that were available and the way they were managed changed.
With fewer and fewer people being sent to Polk, the number of residents dwindled by the 1990s from a few thousand to a few hundred. It became clear that the need for places like Polk no longer really existed. Pennsylvania has 2 remaining state institutions with a steadily declining census. Advocates continue to call for their closure. We now understand the vital importance of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to be able to live like everybody else, to have individualized support, to be empowered, to be able to advocate for oneself.
We were created to live in community. We weren't created to live in isolation, and that's been proven through so many different models, not just the institutional or workshop model in the field that we've been involved in, but I think, throughout society, we know how that fails.
Polk closed in 2023. Its closure is a powerful symbol, but this is not the end of the story. The system of support for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities continues to evolve. Many are in desperate need of services. A smooth road ahead is not guaranteed. Polk's legacy is a reminder that we must continue to evolve our understanding of humanity. Society thrives when it is diverse, when all have a chance to be included and participate. A society is just and fair when its citizens face their assumptions and prejudices about who belongs and who does not. Polk reflects a time when we thought that removing people with developmental and intellectual disabilities from society was the right thing to do. Now we know that it's just the opposite.